Here tonight with Mr. Dan Korn again, author and historian. You said you put in a lot of research with your characters. One that I've always been interested in. What can you tell us about Braxton Bragg? Tragic
Well,
figure or victim of circumstance?
a combination of both. Um, this is a man. People see the pictures of him. The one in particular that shows his gray hair, great big bushy eyebrow dude. It looks like a big horned owl kind of thing, and he's always been given and somewhat, to my opinion, a kind of a bum rap. Uh, First of all, there was a there may have been a medical reason why the man was the way the man was. His mother, while she was carrying him in her womb when she was pregnant with him, was sexually assaulted, physically and sexually assaulted. And in the process of defending herself, she shot and killed her assailant. She was, yeah, she was put on trial. She was acquitted of all the charges, but you can't tell me that the mental and physical stress that that woman suffered through while carrying him inside of her did not in some way transmit itself to him.
Oh.
So there probably were some issues there with him right off the bat with that. Uh, he was always very thin-skinned, somewhat combative, and in my opinion, rather insecure, a bit of a martinet as well. Uh, there's a story about him where he was on a military post and actually was in three capacities. He was the second in command, he was the quartermaster, and he was also in charge of the artillery group, regiment with the artillery.
Really?
Yes. And as the officer in charge of his particular unit, he requested of the quartermaster himself a requisition for specific supplies.
He requested himself.
Yes, he requested of himself.
Okay.
And he turned himself down. Okay. He went through the process again, turned himself down again. Then he tried to go over his head, so to speak, and go write the letter of requisition to the second in command himself regarding the same supplies and materials, and turned himself down again. When his commanding officer returned to the post and heard about all of this, he said to him, "Braxton, you're the only guy I know that can argue with himself and lose the argument." So he had this reputation, throughout the old, what they call the old army. He had fought in the Mexican War. His artillery unit had helped protect Jefferson Davis's command, the Mississippi Rifles, during a particular battle. And a little bit more grape, Mr. Bragg, a little bit more grape, that kind of thing, grape shot. And Davis had a thing about loyalty. If you had helped him out, or if you were his friend or anything like that, you were his friend, and he stuck with you no matter what. And in the case of Braxton Bragg, he stuck with him way too long. Way too long. Bragg was not a good Army commander. He was a good division commander. He was even a pretty good corps commander, but he was not a good Army commander. He just didn't have the human skills necessary in order to deal with the varieties of people that he did. And he had some real characters as far as his command was concerned with that army.
Thin-skinned, he couldn't take criticism, or people
very hard time taking criticism. Very hard time taking criticism. A very thin skin. He would only take it from certain people, and even then he was kind of ruffled a little bit by it. Jefferson Davis was one of the very few people who could actually offer him criticism, but Davis knew how to do it, with him at least, and not have him get all bent out of shape with him. Other people, no, he'd get riled up right away. There's a couple of stories about him just prior to Stones River. One was they had captured a deserter who may or may not actually have been a deserter, and he was to be executed. And Bragg upheld the execution, even though other officers had gone to him and asked him not to do so. And when they were going to shoot this guy, and the night before he was executed, his grave was dug for him.
God.
And during the night, it either rained or there was water from the ground seeping up. So by the time they actually got ready to do the execution, there was about a foot of water sitting in this grave. And the soldier who was to be executed looked down into the hole, saw the water there, and asked someone to get him a lady or someone give him some water, because they sure as hell weren't going to give him any water where they were about to send him. So he literally drank water out of his grave.
God.
In plain view of Braxton Bragg and all the rest of them.
That's creepy.
Bragg refused to stop the execution, even when the guy gave him a earful about the whole thing. He was shot and dumped into the grave and buried. Now, Sam Watkins, who wrote the immortal Sam Watkins Company H story, which is the best story ever written by a Confederate private soldier regarding the war, witnessed this execution and witnessed Bragg's reaction to it and so on. A lot of the soldiers, they didn't like him. They didn't like him at all. They felt he was too strict. He was too much of a martinet, that he couldn't relax, loosen up. And that was one of the
parties.
Pardon?
Not even at a party?
Well, here's the party one that comes along. Shortly after this, just before the Battle of Stones River, Maddie Reddy's wedding took place. Now, this is the woman who marries John Hunt Morgan. And the story goes that about a year before the wedding took place, she didn't even know Morgan, but she heard her father had been a congressman and everything, and the family was pretty well off, one of the pillars of society in Murfreesboro. And she heard two Union officers discussing John Hunt Morgan in a very depreciating way. And she walked up to them and proceeded to berate them regarding Morgan, and saying that someday, she might just find herself as being the bride of John Hunt Morgan. She didn't know him at all, but her brother did. And her brother, when he heard the story, invited Morgan to their home for dinner. He met Maddie. He was a widower at this point. She had never been married. She was only like 17 years old, 17, 18 years old. And he pretty much swept her off her feet. And they were married in her parents' home by Leonidas Polk, Bishop Polk.
Really?
Who was a Confederate general, actually conducted the wedding ceremony. Now, Bragg was in attendance, as was his entire staff. And this was not too long after he had had a meeting with Jefferson Davis, in which Davis had told him, Brax, loosen up, baby. Have some fun. Take things a little easier. So he was trying to enjoy himself at the wedding. And as he was at the wedding, he's walking around with Maddie, talking to different people, and they hear all this laughter coming from one of the rooms in the house. So they started towards the room to see what was going on. And just as they reached the door, Morgan comes walking out the door, sees Bragg has his new bride, sees where they're headed, and quickly intervenes, takes his wife, and walks away. She didn't understand why until later. When Bragg walked through that door, there was the regimental surgeon, Dr. Yandell, who was doing impersonations of various officers. And as Bragg walked through the doorway, and no one saw him until it was too late, Yandell was impersonating Braxton Bragg.
Oh, gosh. How did that go?
Well, it went on for about a minute or so before someone realized Bragg was standing there just staring. And all of a sudden, the room got real quiet. And Yandell looked around and realized himself, oh, my God, the old man is standing there watching me. And he starts sputtering an apology, and Bragg held up his hand and said, that's perfectly fine, doctor. Continue. And then said, continue again, a second time, almost as if a command. Naturally, that Yandell did not. By that point, he was pretty embarrassed. So but that's the way that army was.
Well,
Now you would never dream of anyone doing an impersonation of Robert E. Lee.
right. Yeah.
But not like that. And
How,
they did Braxton Bragg.
I've heard stories that Bragg was a strict disciplinarian. I think you just touched on it. They said he was, they were really good at drill, but Bragg he would execute soldiers rather relatively
Well,
easy. I mean,
he had quite the reputation for discipline and executions, and that did not sit well with guys like Ben Cheatham, um, John C. Breckinridge, and others, and Hardy was a pretty strict guy himself. I mean, he had written the drill manual, but they just they didn't like him, and Nathan Bedford Forrest hated his guts.
uh, I've heard, I've heard that they was it him he threatened or was it Hood? I
It
can't
was
remember.
Bragg. Yeah. Well, what happened was that Bragg had gotten him reassigned to command another unit and brought in Joe Wheeler. Joe Wheeler was all of like 26, 27 years old at that point. And Bragg felt he could control him better, the war child. And Forrest took it personally, which he was entitled to, in my opinion. Went to Bragg's tent and confronted Bragg over the whole thing and threatened Bragg with his life. In fact, he challenged him basically to a duel and threatened him. And Bragg did nothing, of course, did not respond. And when Forrest left, he looked at him and told him, "No, don't you ever give me another order again, or I'll kill you," in front of witnesses. And got on his horse and rode away. And Bragg did nothing about it. Did nothing about it. I can just see someone doing that with Robert E. Lee or some of the other generals. No, that wouldn't have happened. But Forrest, Bragg stayed away from him. They did not meet again, and Forrest probably would have done it. He didn't mess
Bragg
around.
as a commander. I'll look at some, the Kentucky invasion, and then I look at how well his army performed at Chickamauga. I mean, what happened? Was it just he off tactics didn't get coordinated properly? I mean, why did he fail so bad? Other than that battle,
Well,
or did he fail that bad?
Chickamauga was a stroke of luck on their part.
Okay,
as far as what happened there.
Well, we say a lot of battles are though. I mean,
yes,
okay.
yes, but he also had a long streak at Chickamauga that he didn't have at other times.
True.
Stones River is wintertime. It's a wintertime fight, and the weather was lousy. They're fighting in some unbelievably bad terrain. I mean, if you go to Stones River and you walk through that section of the park called where the dragon's teeth are, which was a horrific part of the battle. I mean, you've got these, they look like rows and rows of teeth that come up out of the ground, limestone rock in rows and rows. And to attack through there had to be murderous. And the soldiers, get in there and hide. And they say they're still finding remnants of the remains in those rocks and everything. I would not be a bit surprised, having walked through it myself several times. That's the case. But you couldn't fight artillery in there. It had to be infantry, hand to hand, unless you were shooting artillery into it and trying to use the stone of the rock and everything, to blast the rock, to throw shards of stone all over the place and kill people, which of course also did happen. But that was a rough fight, and he wasn't able to drive them out at the end of that first day. They were still there, and nobody fought the next day. They just kind of licked their wounds, and then he had attempts an attack in the afternoon, late in the day, across the river. Well, the Union Army had lined up a massive row of cannon up there. It was almost like what Pickett was, the Yankees had all the cannon lined up on the ridge there at Cemetery Ridge when Pickett tried to attack, or on Malvern Hill even more so, like a Malvern Hill. There were
Oh,
something like
okay.
60 artillery pieces, give or take, that were lined up on that ridge. And when the Confederates came across that river, it was just sheer murder. Sheer murder. And Breckinridge had tried to talk him out of making that attack, and he refused. And he ordered Breckinridge to. That's where that's where the nickname of the Orphans Brigade comes from. Is that fight?
Okay. Oh, I didn't. Oh, okay. That
Okay,
makes
because they
sense.
were Kentuckians, and when and Breckinridge, when his men were coming back from that battle, he just stood there watching them and going, "My poor orphans, my poor orphans."
I,
That's the
I,
Orphans
I
Brigade.
did. I didn't know that's how that story
Yeah,
came from.
yes, yes, it actually comes from that battle. Uh, the
What
river,
happened in the? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, it was cold. Those guys
It
are
was
not
in
allowed to
December, right?
light fires and stuff, so they were freezing.
His Kentucky invasion. Why did that fail?
Um, Poor planning, poor organization, sheer bad luck. Um, Don Carlos Buell got lucky as far as the northern forces were concerned, and uh, he did some things right, and they did some things wrong. And then, unfortunately, you had a problem with split command in that battle between the Confederate forces, which didn't work real well, as it turned out. And as a result of that, Perryville was a Yankee victory. So,
I mean, they were
but
pretty bad outnumbered at Perryville too, right?
yeah, and that was a nasty fight. Those battles in Tennessee were bad. They were bad. Tennessee was second only to Virginia in terms of the number of battles. And when you look at the names of the battles that took place in Tennessee, I mean, Forts Henry and Donelson, Shiloh, Stones River, Murfreesboro, Chickamauga, um, uh, um, the Battle of Lookout Mountain,
You
Missionary Ridge,
you
the
said that
Battle of Franklin. Oh my God, Franklin, horrible fight.
you said that
Nashville. You know,
that Davis loyalty was very important to him. So I got a question. I wondered. Davis and Joseph Johnston did not like each other.
they did not.
Okay, why did when they put together that ragtag group there uh, to take on Sherman? Why did he not put Bragg back in command instead of put Johnston?
I think he would have had an open revolt on his hands if he had. He had all of the top commanders in that army had signed a letter of petition to Davis requesting him to relieve Bragg.
Is that? Oh, okay. That's when he's okay. When he was relieved,
Right?
all the officers said
And
that.
Davis did not replace him at that time. And then Chickamauga took place, and then he allows the Yankee army to get away to Chattanooga, and he does not do what is necessary to shut them down, to capture them.
Isn't
I mean,
that
yes, he
kind
had
of?
troops up on Lookout Mountain, and he had troops on Missionary Ridge, and he had them surrounded, but he didn't do a good enough job of surrounding them.
Isn't that? I mean, isn't that the same thing they criticize people with Meade for, though? I mean, he suffered 18,000 casualties at Chickamauga. I mean, how hard of a pursuit could he? I mean, he was pretty chewed up to give.
Um, I think he was very chewed up, and I don't think he could have made as big a pursuit as some people seem to think.
Yeah, I don't either. I
Thomas
mean,
Thomas did a remarkable job of
could he
holding
have?
Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge.
Could he have finished? I mean, could he have pushed harder that day and knocked him out? You think?
Maybe, maybe. His best troops had been pretty much used up by this point. A lot of names died or were seriously wounded in Chickamauga. You mean, you lose Sam Hood loses his leg at
Right.
that fight. Ben Helms, Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law, is killed in that battle. Hans
Oh
Christian
wow.
Haig, who was one of the up-and-coming division commanders in the Union Army, fatally wounded at Chickamauga. Richard Kirkland, the Angel of Mary's Heights, by this time is a lieutenant, and he is killed in the attacks on Horseshoe Ridge. So a lot of names do
So is
not
there anything
survive that fight.
Bragg could have done differently? I mean, after
Well,
after the battle, or I mean, is there
uh,
just
I don't, I don't. I'm not sure he could have done much more differently than they did. I mean, um, Rosecrans never should have been in that position in the first place to allow them to do what they did. But he got himself so worked up.
give us a little synopsis of the Battle of Chickamauga?
Pardon?
Like, give us a little synopsis of it.
Well,
Uh,
there are factors to this fight that people don't realize. First of all, Rosecrans had done a brilliant the Tullahoma campaign of coming through the mountain passes and forcing Bragg out of Chattanooga, basically almost without a shot being fired.
right.
Some skirmishes here, some minor battles, but that's about it. When the two armies meet at Chickamauga, now Bragg has been reinforced by almost a whole corps from the Army of Northern Virginia under Longstreet. Uh, Longstreet brought all of his divisions except for Pickett's with him there. I forget how many hours those men were on the trains and everything. They had to make so many changes and adjustments and stuff to get them there, and then they were marched out of Atlanta and everything, and up to the Chickamauga battlefield. Excuse me. Longstreet himself was almost captured the night before the fight. He and his officers were not met at the railroad station like they were supposed to be by a guide, and were fumbling away in the dark trying to find themselves to Bragg's headquarters, and ran into a Yankee patrol in the dark, and fortunately were able to talk themselves out of there before they were recognized or seen or realized what they were and captured. So they did manage to get to Bragg's headquarters. Bragg had very little to do with them as far as giving him any direction or anything else like that, which ticked Longstreet off because he was used to the way Lee operated. But the plans for attack were not well put together, and as a result of it, and on the opposite side, Rosecrans was a nervous wreck. He had the Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana, sitting in his camp, watching every move that he was making as more like a spy for Seward. And his new chief of staff, James A. Garfield, wasn't necessarily the most reliable guy as far as having his back was concerned, because Garfield was a politician, very much a politician. And he was looking out for him. The best soldier that he had was, of course, George Thomas.
Right.
George Thomas was an amazing commander. He should have been
If he
in charge
lands
of the
that
army.
blow, if he lands that knockout blow there, does it change the war, or
No,
does it put off the
no, I
inevitable?
don't think so. I don't think it would have. I think Grant would have just come back and brought in whatever was necessary in order to come back and do the job.
Yeah, but would that
It might
would
have
that
it
have
might have
been
it might have lengthened the war, but I don't think
lengthened the
it would
war?
have ended the war. It would have been just another. It would have ended up most likely being just another empty victory, the same way that Fredericksburg was and Chancellorsville were. Those were great victories, but what did they actually achieve?
Well,
Nothing.
it's interesting you say that, because I've heard people talk about pirate victories, and with what they were strategy of defense offense, it caused the Union Army to withdraw. And I've always said if there was more pirate victories early on in the West, the South would have won that war. The Union would have stopped.
Yeah. Well,
At that point, you're so late in the war. Then, how much does that really, help? But, after Vicksburg and Gettysburg. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I was just
sorry.
talking about that.
Well,
So,
you did not have the command structure in the West for the Confederate forces, armies, the same way you did in the East. I mean, Robert E. Lee was in charge, and everybody knew that. As far as the Army of Northern Virginia was concerned in those forces, you did not have the backbiting going on at the upper level with that army that you did at the Army of Army of Tennessee. You
Is
didn't have the
that
bickering
also,
going on.
that's because of Bragg's style? You just
Sorry,
style. That's because of Bragg's style of
I
bickering and
believe so.
arguing.
I believe so. He
Who
he, he just didn't get along with people real well,
did
and
Davis go out and
unfortunately,
meet with
he
him
had
before he
real
relieved him?
feisty guys.
Or was it who was it? Did Davis go out and meet with him, or Davis sent some commander out to meet with him before he relieved? Or Johnston? Did he send Johnston out to meet with him?
Joe Johnston.
Yeah, he sent Joe after before he relieved him. Did he sent
Yeah,
Johnston out to meet with him?
and
Okay.
Johnston's a very courtly, cavalier kind of guy, whereas Bragg is just not. And the two of them just rubbed each other wrong to begin with. There isn't anybody when you actually sit down and read what they all have to say. None of them like Bragg. None of them. And he just rubbed people the wrong way. Longstreet couldn't stand him. Uh, Breckinridge hated him. Chalmers, Cheatham, those guys, they disliked him intensely. Hanson, all these Confederate commanders did not care for him at all. He held on to that job because of his rep, if you will, his liaison with Davis.
So just out of loyalty, Davis held on to him in that position.
Yeah, he really did for longer than he should have. And then he turns around and makes him his senior military advisor after he pulled him out of there finally.
And yeah, I mean, and then he was sent back, and he was a corps commander up under the last little hurrah there for the Confederacy with up under Johnston. What?
Yeah, it just he was just not someone you could put in command of an army. It just wasn't there.
And you said fine as what was?
It was
He
fine.
was
Division commander. It was a very good division commander, and it was a better than average corps commander, but not as an army commander. Mm-mm. He didn't have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like I hate to make a sports analogy. Some guys are coordinators, and some guys are head coaches. That's been well, that's been an interesting segment on Bragg. We'll have to do another one. Well, we'll just make a series then. Bring it back and have stories on our Union side if you'd like to do that.
Sure.